First of all, I'd just like to say how much I enjoyed the last hour or so. Those presentations were just fantastic. I think they offer such a wonderful overview of the importance of a language framework, of the rationale for developing it, of the impact it can have on all aspects of the system. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today, is how such a framework can act as a driver of change within the system. I skip by my abstract. Just reflecting briefly on the other talks we heard from NAES about the enormous success of the CEFR. Now, it's primarily in testing and assessment, but it has had successes and it's beginning to grow now into the other areas of the delivery of learning through materials, teacher training, and in the curriculum. I think it's really important that we consider the rationale for creating the CEFR in the first place. It had as much to do with human rights as it had to do with language and language policy. Essentially seeing language as an essential human right. And I think that's a fantastically important thing to remember as we look towards making a decision to move in this direction in Taiwan. We heard from Masashi about the success of the CEFRJ, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the most effective localization or adaptation anywhere. He urges caution, of course. It takes time, it takes a lot of effort, a lot of energy to build such an effective framework. But it also shows us that there is a way forward, that the framework presented in the CEFR is very valuable in the European context. But as we move out of that context, we have to look at the local context to see where the CEFR needs to be localized to make it more valuable within that context. Nick presented a number of very valuable models underlying the CEFR in terms of alignment within the system. Gave us some very good examples. I particularly was interested in the example from Italy, which is a long ongoing project. We look at it, it's 20 years on the go now. It's beginning, I shouldn't say beginning, it has already begun to show some significant impacts on the education system in general, even as Nick pointed out, that students in certain areas are actually able to move on towards a CLIL, which is an English language learning environment, which is precisely where the ministry in Taiwan would like the Taiwanese system to move towards. Admittedly, it may take longer than expected, but there is clear example there of how success can be reached. I think Sarah's one talk was very interesting. I was interested, I've always been interested in the concept of assessment for learning as opposed to of learning, but I think it brought through the whole aspect of what we need to do to make it happen. We need to professionalize the system, and that means, I guess, not just the teachers, but the other stakeholders must understand the value of building in constant review, evaluation, and feedback to learners, so that they feel they're learning and they feel they're part of the system. And I think that's a very important thing. When we think of some of the other presentations as well, talked about how, while this is very valuable, I think it was Nick pointed out the fact that there's just not enough hours within the education system to learn. So while all of these are valuable, we need to think beyond the system. We need to think of how language within that learning context can be made more available to learners. And finally, we heard an eloquent, I felt, rationale for the development of a framework in Taiwan. Not just the rationale, because I think, as far as I'm concerned, it's what I would call a no-brainer. It's a very obvious thing that should be done. It will clearly helped to develop and to professionalize language education in Taiwan. And as Jessica was able to point out to us, it's not as if we're starting from a 0 point in time. We've got the CEFR. We've got many years of using the CEFR in Taiwan. We have data from relevant assessments that are locally based from Taiwan, over 8 million, as we heard. And we have the experience of Masashi and his team in Japan, where such a project has been successfully undertaken. So we're not starting from scratch. We have a huge step up to begin with and to build on. And I felt that came through very well in that presentation. When we think of a system as a whole, then we think of all of the levels. And I think of it as, you know, we talk about now of lifelong learning. We could almost have another post-work element here, but primarily we're looking at the primary levels, secondary level, higher education, and then local and international companies, which I do think is an important stage, because as we're looking at the system, we think about those key transition points. Now, it's absolutely vital that within our curricula and within the development and delivery of that curricula, that we link each of these sections through the transition points. That unfortunately doesn't always happen. This is the ideal. There's a constant move upwards. So the learner's language level, as they move through the system, is developing all the time and continues to develop beyond the formal education system into their later life learning of language. If that was the reality, we wouldn't need this talking today. The reality is that we often find a system where, because each element of the system has its own triangle, if you like, with curriculum, delivery, and assessment, its own language program, we see a development through the program until we get to a certain point. In primary school, for example, then people go to secondary school, and it's almost like they need to start again. They start again almost from the beginning and make some progress, but then go to higher education, and it's like, or they need to start again, and they start again. It's like Groundhog Day almost. People are never really progressing at the rate they need to progress. There is progression, but it's not at the rate they should be progressing, because there isn't any clear way of linking the different elements of the system, because the transition points are essentially ignored. So if that was the case, it wouldn't actually be too bad, because at least there's progress being made. The reality of life is that we often find that there's almost no progress being made for the vast majority of people as they go through the system. Some people will always buck the trend, but there's very, very little genuine progress made in their language as they progress through the system. Now, one of the causes of that, I'm convinced, is the focus on too narrow a range of language. We're looking at essentially receptive skills. The receptive skills will only get you so far, but you will never be able to communicate or use the language. And as we see in the way the CEFR companion volume, the CV volume, has moved, we're now moving away from this concept of the 4 skills to a kind of a 6 skills, if you like. So we have the receptive, we have the productive, but within the context of mediation and interaction. We need to be building towards something more solid. And I believe that these transition points are key. What we really need to be thinking of is transition points where we have a systematic and controlled movement through the learning system, right through the levels, so that we don't go back to the beginning again, so that we build on in the secondary what we've learned in primary, we build in higher what we've learned in secondary, and then we make people ready for the industry, for their working life post formal study. We can do that best, I believe, by having clearly defined transition points, possibly not assessed at the primary to secondary level, but certainly there should be some level of assessment, formal assessment of all of the skills needed to progress from one level to the next. To do that, we need a single learning system, a single curriculum, a single concept of delivery, and a single concept of assessment that feeds into all of these levels. So instead of being seen as different levels of education, that they're all seen as education, it's all seen as the same plan, the same action plan is needed. So, and that way we can help to drive learning in the right direction so that we have a measurable and increase in levels. If we think about the standards then within the CLS, the comprehensive learning system, the comprehensive learning system essentially is that CDA, curriculum delivery assessment. It is underpinned by a development model. So we should understand what's the way that a language can develop within the individual. And we're looking at assessment of learning, for learning, it's by learning, every way we look at it. But we also have underpinning measurement model. And that's where having a set of standards really comes into its own. Because the standards can drive the whole system. The standards can mean that we know what people need to know and how they need to be able to use the language as they progress through the system. It will also have an underlying measurement model, which the CEFR has, and which the CFRJ has, and which the CFRT, the proposed CFRT, should have and will have. All of that then drives the system. That's the bones of the system. But of course, without thinking about the consequences of delivering such a system into the context of use, and the context of use now is Taiwan, is the educational and social system of Taiwan. We must think of the consequences. So in order to do that, we need a very clear idea of a theory of action. How are we going to achieve this exactly? What are the things that we need to think of? Who are the stakeholders that we need to think of? And here's a list of some of the people we may need to be thinking about. We also need a communication model so that we can communicate effectively right from the beginning of the system, so that we can bring these people with us. So we're not developing this as a bunch of experts who sit in an ivory tower, who don't communicate with people until we have a wonderful solution ready. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it, I believe, is to bring the stakeholders with you, to get buy-in from the beginning so that they come along with you the whole way. Of course, this is never going to happen unless they see, and we as developers see, the clear link between the standards and the context of use. For me, that's the one reason why we should not use in its raw form the Common European Framework within this context. I think it's been great over the years. It's helped to communicate and to define levels within Taiwan up to now. But I think it's now time that the language education system in Taiwan is ready, I believe, is mature enough to now begin to think about the need for a localized set of standards that are more developed for the context of use, much in the same way as has happened in Japan. And for that we need what I would call whole system development. So the standards will drive the curriculum, the delivery of teaching and learning, and assessment. The standards drive everything, right across all of the levels. And if we do it in that way, and if we build transitions between the levels into our system in a way that are meaningful, in other words, the curriculum, the delivery systems for the curriculum, and the assessment points, the key assessment points between those transition points are built in a meaningful way to reflect the theoretical and practical support or support system, if you like, for this developed by the standards. Then we can actually help learners in Taiwan to move smoothly through the system. Obviously, it's not going to be as simple as that. There are going to be difficulties on the way. There are going to be challenges on the way. But I'm convinced, if we conceive of all of this as a full system development, then we can make the system work. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.